In the winter of 1943, a Soviet T-34 crew survived 17 separate impacts in a single engagement. Not one shell breached the hull. Not one fragment entered the fighting compartment. When the tank finally limped back to friendly lines 3 hours later, the driver was discovered unresponsive at his station. His eyes were open. His hands still gripped the control levers. His body showed no visible wounds. Medical officers would later determine that his eardrums had ruptured on the fourth impact. By the 12th, something inside him had simply stopped functioning. He died 2 days later without ever speaking again. The official cause of death was listed as concussive trauma, but the men who pulled him from that untouched, unbreached, technically victorious tank knew the truth was something far more unsettling. Something the armor was never designed to protect against. Something that existed in the violence between survival and death. We measure tank survivability in penetration charts, in millimeters of rolled homogeneous steel, in velocity calculations and angle of incidence. These metrics fill technical manuals and war college lectures with reassuring precision. They promise a kind of certainty that commanders crave and crews desperately want to believe. A shell either punches through the armor or it doesn't. The crew either dies violently in a catastrophic kill, or they survive to fight another day. But this binary understanding obscures a third possibility that tankers across every theater of the Second World War came to understand intimately, painfully, permanently. The shell that doesn't penetrate still arrives, still carries energy that must go somewhere, still demands that something absorb the terrible violence of its impact. When armored plate refuses to yield, when it does exactly what it was designed to do, that energy doesn't simply vanish into nothing. It travels, it echoes, it reverberates. It finds the soft, fragile, irreplaceable things waiting on the other side. The men inside those steel boxes learned to fear the hit that failed. To understand why non-penetrating impacts proved so devastating to human beings, we must first examine what a tank actually was to the men assigned to crew it. The romantic image persists across generations of the tank as a mobile fortress, a protective steel shell that allowed men to carry the fight across open ground while remaining shielded from the violence consuming everything around them. This was true in the narrowest technical sense. Tank armor absolutely stopped bullets, shrapnel, and many projectiles that would have instantly killed exposed infantry. But protection came with costs that doctrine writers rarely addressed and recruitment officers never mentioned. The interior of a fighting vehicle was not a refuge. It was a sealed metal container filled with high explosive ammunition, volatile fuel, sharp mechanical edges, and complex equipment, all packed tightly around 4 or 5 human bodies, positioned in ways that prioritize combat function over crew safety. The crew of a medium tank in 1943 worked inside a space roughly equivalent to the interior of a family automobile, but with fully half that precious volume filled with engines, transmissions, ammunition racks, and mechanical equipment. Hatches were kept closed under combat conditions to prevent spalling and fragmentation from entering the fighting compartment. This operational necessity meant severely limited ventilation, slowly accumulating exhaust fumes, summer temperatures that routinely exceeded 130 degrees Fahrenheit, and almost no ability to see beyond the narrow slits and vision blocks that offered incomplete glimpses of the lethal world outside. Sound was constant and overwhelming to the point of physical pain. The engine roared directly behind the crew at levels that made verbal communication nearly impossible. Radio headsets helped somewhat, but many crews, particularly Soviet and earlier war German units, operated with incomplete, malfunctioning, or entirely absent communication equipment. Men learned to read intention from touch, from gesture, from the particular rhythm of movement through the cramped fighting compartment. Into this already hostile environment came the shells. Anti-tank weapons of the Second World War varied enormously in design, caliber, and capability, but most operated on similar fundamental principles. A projectile was accelerated to extremely high velocities and directed at armored plate with lethal intent. If the projectile carried sufficient kinetic energy and struck at a favorable angle, it would defeat the armor through penetration, through spalling, or through catastrophic deformation. The crew inside would die from direct impact of the penetrating round, from fragments of the projectile or the armor itself becoming secondary projectiles, from the ignition of fuel or stored ammunition, or from the catastrophic structural failure of the vehicle around them. These deaths were often instantaneous, sometimes merciful in their terrible speed. But when the mathematics of armor penetration failed the shooter, when the angle of impact was wrong, when the range stretched too far, when the armor proved just thick enough to resist, something entirely different occurred. The projectile struck and was defeated. From outside, observers might see a shower of bright sparks, a visible impact scar, perhaps a gouge in the paint and surface steel. The tank appeared untouched and fully functional. It could often continue moving, continue fighting, continue serving its tactical purpose. The official designation for these events was non-penetrating hit. The term suggested something routine and expected, harmless even, a victory for engineering. Inside, the experience was anything but harmless. The first sensation was sound. Survivors universally described the impact not as a single discrete noise, but as a physical force that entered through the bones of the skull. The human ear could not process the report quickly enough for the brain to interpret it as meaningful information. Instead, it arrived as overwhelming pressure, as a kind of violent presence that momentarily displaced thought itself. Tank crewmen exposed to multiple non-penetrating hits frequently lost the ability to process sound normally for hours or days afterward. Some never recovered baseline hearing for the remainder of their lives. The enclosed steel space amplified and reflected sound waves in ways that open battlefields never could replicate. A shell striking the exterior created not just the initial terrible report, but a series of reflected reverberations that seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing between steel surfaces until the entire compartment became a chamber of pure noise. Then came the shock transmission through solid structure. Steel plate, struck by a high-velocity projectile, doesn't simply absorb energy and remain still. It flexes. It rings like a massive bell. That vibration travels through every structural connection, through mounting brackets and welds, through seats and floor plates, through the very air trapped inside the compartment. Men reported feeling impacts in their teeth, in their spines, in their organs. Medical examinations conducted after the war documented perforated eardrums, detached retinas, internal bleeding, and organ damage in tank crewmen who had never once been exposed to penetrating hits. Their tanks had protected them perfectly according to every technical measure. The armor that saved their lives also served as an efficient transmission medium for trauma that found other ways to destroy them. Spalling presented another danger entirely, one that existed in the space between penetration and safety. Even when armor successfully stopped a projectile from entering the crew compartment, the inner surface of the plate could fracture under the tremendous stress, sending fragments of the tank's own protective steel ricocheting through the fighting compartment at velocities approaching those of bullet fire. These spall fragments followed no predictable path. They bounced off internal surfaces, off ammunition racks and radio equipment, off the bodies of crewmen desperately trying to understand what was happening. A tank commander standing in his cupola might take a spall fragment in the leg that had originated from an impact in the driver's compartment on the opposite end of the vehicle. Later war tanks incorporated spall liners, layers of specially treated fabric or early composite materials designed to catch these fragments before they reached human flesh. But early war vehicles offered no such protection. The men inside were surrounded by their own armor, which could become shrapnel at any moment. German tankers on the Eastern Front developed a particular dread of facing Soviet anti-tank rifles throughout the long years of that campaign. These weapons, the PTRD and PTRS, rarely achieved clean penetration against the frontal armor of vehicles like the Panzer IV. On paper, they were marginally effective at best, but German crews learned quickly that survival against these weapons was not the same as safety. A PTRD round striking armor would create an impact bruise, a localized deformation that pushed the inner surface of the plate inward even without breaking through. Tank crews could trace these deformations from inside their vehicles, seeing the steel surface push toward them in the rough, terrifying shape of the projectile that had struck it. Men sitting near these impact points reported numbness, deep tissue bruising, and in severe cases, broken bones from the transmitted shock alone. The round never entered. The violence found its way inside regardless. A loader in a Panzer III described returning from an engagement against Soviet infantry positions in late 1942. His tank had been struck 9 times by anti-tank rifle fire during a confused close-range battle. None of the rounds penetrated the hull or turret. The tank remained fully operational by every mechanical measure. When he removed his padded helmet after reaching the assembly area, he discovered his ears were bleeding freely. When he tried to lift ammunition canisters for the next engagement, his arms refused to respond to his commands. Strength had simply left him. He was evacuated to a field hospital, not because his tank was destroyed or even damaged, but because his body had absorbed enough transmitted violence to render him completely combat ineffective. He returned to the line 3 weeks later, still experiencing headaches and hearing difficulties. The tank he'd crewed had been destroyed by Soviet artillery in his absence, its entire replacement crew killed instantly. He sometimes wondered if the tank remembered what they had survived together, if metal could carry memory the way flesh carried scars. Soviet tank crews developed their own rituals and understandings around the strange phenomenon of survival. The T-34, renowned throughout the war for its brilliantly effective sloped armor, successfully defeated countless German rounds during 4 years of brutal combat. But the cost of that protection was borne entirely by the men inside the hull. T-34 crews reported impacts that threw them bodily against equipment, against each other, against the unforgiving steel walls of their fighting compartment. Unconsciousness from single impacts was common. Temporary blindness occurred when the shockwave disrupted visual processing in the brain. Disorientation could last for hours after heavy engagements. Many crews who successfully survived major tank battles were unable to continue fighting, not because their vehicle was damaged, but because their bodies had simply reached a physiological limit. They were not wounded. They were not injured in any way that appeared in casualty reports. They were simply finished. American tankers in the European theater faced a particular psychological burden during the final year of the war. The M4 Sherman was not designed or armored to resist the high-velocity 75 and 88 mm weapons that German forces employed extensively by 1944. When Sherman crews did survive non-penetrating hits, it was often against lesser threats, against infantry Panzerfaust weapons at extended range, or against artillery fragments that struck but failed to breach the relatively thin armor. These survivals generated a complex and corrosive emotional response. Relief mixed immediately with the certain knowledge that they had simply been lucky, that the next shell might not strike at such a favorable angle, that their survival meant nothing about future survival. Sherman crews developed what medical officers would later identify as anticipatory trauma, a constant state of physiological tension rooted in the expectation of imminent violence even during periods of relative safety. They lived in their tanks knowing the protection was marginal. Every non-penetrating hit reminded them how close they were to the alternative. The psychological weight of survival inside armor often proved more enduring than any physical injuries. A British tank commander serving in North Africa wrote in a letter home that he had stopped fearing death inside his Crusader tank. Death, he reasoned with the strange clarity that extended combat sometimes brings, would at least be complete, final, understandable. What he feared was the hit that left him alive, but fundamentally changed. The hit that took his hearing permanently, his sight, his ability to think clearly, and remember his family. He watched men climb out of tanks after heavy engagements who could no longer hold a conversation, who flinched violently at every unexpected sound, who had aged decades in the space of hours. These men were not wounded in any way that earned medals or official recognition. They were simply diminished. Something had been taken from them that would never return. The war ended. The surviving tanks were melted down for civilian steel, placed in museums as curiosities, or left to rust in forgotten proving grounds across 3 continents. The men who crewed them returned to a world that understood armor in simple terms. The tank either burned or it didn't. The crew either died in flames or they walked away unscathed. There was no category for what existed between these outcomes. but many who walked away carried something with them into peacetime, a ringing that never quite faded regardless of how many years passed, a sensitivity to sudden sounds that made factories and city streets almost unbearable, dreams of metal chambers and impacts without end that came without warning decades later. They had discovered something that no technical manual addressed, a truth that exists in the space between the numbers and the charts. The armor protects the crew from death. It makes no promise about protecting them from survival. And sometimes survival inside a sealed steel box, survival through the repeated transmitted violence of impacts that the machine successfully defeats, costs something that doesn't appear in casualty reports, something that never stops echoing off the walls of memory. When they closed their eyes at night, decades later, some of them could still hear it, the sound of salvation arriving again and again, the sound of shells that didn't quite break through, the sound of everything that happened anyway.